Welcome back to Law and Crime Live, everybody. We are covering the George Birch case out of Wisconsin. We expect a live feed today in the courtroom at 9:30 a.m., so you're not going to want to miss anything. As soon as we do have a feed, we're going to make sure to go to it, and we will talk about the George Birch case in depth. But before we do, I want to talk about a case that we've been covering this past week and which we mentioned at the beginning of the hour, the Donald Smith case, because there was an update. Again, the man who was convicted of abducting, brutally raping, and murdering a beautiful 8-year-old girl named Cherish Periwinkle. The same jury that convicted him decided yesterday, after a little over 2 hours of deliberation, that he should be sentenced to death. That's right, they had a unanimous jury verdict. They recommended the death penalty, but will it stick? That becomes the question, and will there be justice for young 8-year-old Cherish Periwinkle? I want to bring in right now Law and Crime trial analyst, fellow host here on the network, and my good friend, Misty Marris. Misty, great to see you.
Thank you so much, Jesse. I'm happy to be here to talk about these trials. These are really capturing the nation's attention, so I've got to break these down.
I know, I'm glad to have you here. I want to talk a little bit about the death penalty, because we talked all this week about how it's in the jury's hands, and in a sense it is, but under Florida law, they can only recommend the death penalty, right? Doesn't the judge actually have to impose the sentence?
Right. The judge actually has to enter the sentence. So the judge has the decision to say, look, the jury's decision, the jury's verdict, the jury's penalty is disproportionate to the crime. So the judge can say, I don't believe this is a death penalty case. It's up to the judge ultimately. Although, I will say, Jesse, in a case like this, it would be very unlikely that the judge would not defer to the jury. And that's why you're probably going to see the jury's verdict upheld in this case, although the judge does have that discretion.
What way would the judge say not to impose the death penalty? Could you have a judge on the court who says, I'm just anti-death penalty, or you need an unbiased judge?
Yeah, they're not supposed to say, I'm anti-death penalty. An anti-death penalty judge, you could seek recusal for that judge, because Florida is a state where the death penalty is an option in a criminal case. And if a jury determines that the death penalty is proportionate and appropriate for the defendant, then it's up to the judge to make that decision, not based on their own personal and political views, but based on the law and based on issues of proportionality.
Now, we know Smith's attorneys will have one more bite at the apple. They can present a little bit more evidence to try to defend Smith before his final sentence. What can they say?
Right. So what you have in Florida is an interesting rule with respect to the death penalty. Of course, the death penalty, the most serious sentence, the most serious penalty for any criminal defendant. So what you have is the opportunity in what's called a Spencer hearing. And this came out of a landmark case back in the 90s. At a Spencer hearing, the defense attorneys have one more crack at convincing the judge that the death penalty is inappropriate. And here's what they do, Jesse. They present mitigating factors. So they may go back into the defendant's life, find mitigating factors, talk about issues. But Jesse, there's another aspect to it that's very interesting because, and this is why it's a little bit unique in Florida, they can also argue that there was reasonable doubt. Now, this will not impact the guilty verdict. It doesn't change the fact that a jury of his peers found him guilty. But the judge can say, look, there was evidence of reasonable doubt. Because of that, the death penalty is too severe of a punishment. But I must say,
you know what,
when
Misty,
you watch this case, you've got a child.
Misty, you're a great attorney. Thanks for explaining it to me. Not going to work for him. I don't think it's going to work so well for him, but we'll stay tuned to that case. And again, we are covering it here on Law and Crime Live, and if there is an update, we're going to make sure to talk about it. But I want to shift focus right now. I want to shift focus to our main case of the day, a huge case out of Wisconsin, the George Birch case. Now, we saw the testimony yesterday of Douglas Dietrich, who is the victim's boyfriend. Remember, the victim in this case is Nicole Vanderheiden, a young mother who was, her body was found 3 miles from her home. She suffered blunt force trauma to the head and strangulation. Now, George Birch is the one on trial. His DNA was found all over her body. His cell phone pinpoints him in 4 key locations that night, including the crime scene and where her body was found. And despite all that evidence, the defense is not refuting any of it. But they said he's not the one who did it. It was Douglas Dietrich. It was Nicole's boyfriend who did it. And when you saw him on the stand yesterday, you really saw the attorneys pressing him. I want to play you some of his testimony, and then Misty and I are going to talk about it. Take a look.
Doug, were you ever charged? Is there a formal charging document charging you with the murder of Nicole Vanderheiden?
No, I was not.
Doug, you were asked on cross-examination about your ownership of some guns. You own a handgun?
No, I do not.
Mr. Sugar had asked you if you took a shower before meeting with police officers. When did you take a shower on May 21st?
It was after I made the call for the missing persons report, and I was wearing the clothes from the night before, and I needed to just feel cleaned up and refreshed, I guess.
Would it be typical for you to take a shower during the day
Yes, definitely.
prior to meeting with people?
Yes.
The clothing that you were wearing at the bar the previous night, you were wearing that exact same clothing when you met with the sheriff's office? Excuse me, the pants at least and the shoes?
I was wearing the same pants and same shoes.
And the undershirt, the t-shirt that you were wearing, that 94-7 t-shirt, you still wearing that the next day?
I was still wearing that the next day in the morning, up until I did take the shower at 4:30 approximately.
Doug, I'm showing you what's been marked as exhibit number 43. Can you identify that exhibit?
That is a picture of my son and me in the morning or afternoon. I don't exactly recall when it was, but I sent that to Nikki in a Snapchat message directly to her.
That's the message you sent to Nikki on the 21st. And what was the purpose of sending that Snapchat to her?
Just mommy and daddy daddy and Dylan are here waiting for mommy to get home, just to see if she would respond at all and see if she would open the Snapchat. You can tell if she's opened it, and then, I would see that her phone was on, and then if she was ignoring me.
Just
or
a
not.
regular boyfriend or a killer? That becomes the question. As you heard the prosecution under redirect trying to cut away all the defense's theories, saying, look, you were never charged in her murder, you don't own a handgun, and so what if you took a shower before the police came? It's typical for people to take showers. It's good play. It's interesting to watch. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back to talk about this case. Hey everybody, welcome back to Law and Crime Live. We are waiting for a live feed in the George Birch case out of Wisconsin. We're waiting for a live feed in that courtroom. We expect it around 9:30 a.m. today. As soon as we have a feed, we'll make sure to go to it. But let's talk a little bit about what's happened so far in the case. And yesterday was a big day because Douglas Dietrich continued his testimony. And who is that? That is the boyfriend of the victim in this case. The victim is Nicole Vanderheiden, who was killed back in May of 2016. George Birch is on trial for her murder. He's charged with first-degree intentional homicide. But his defense team is blaming Douglas Dietrich. They're saying that he is the killer. And we're going to play for you in a little bit some of the cross-examination of him on the stand, and it's pretty good. It's pretty juicy. I want to, again, bring in a very special friend, law and crime trial analyst and fellow host here on the network, Misty Marris. Misty, Doug Dietrich went on the stand 2 days. He was on for 2 days. Again, I'm not sure I see something so sinister or just a guy who got into a fight with his girlfriend, kind of ignored her, was doing some drugs, was drinking. A big deal. Is that a killer?
Right. Well, this is the witness everybody was waiting for, right? Because this is the person that the defense is looking to say, this is the guy who did it, not the defendant. So his testimony is really critical to the case. But I agree with you, Jesse. I think what came out are the facts that the defense had to focus on, the fact that there were drugs involved, the fact that there was this altercation, some text messages between the two that seemed to be a little bit
Let's talk about the drugs. He was a little evasive in terms of, did you snort Adderall that night? Did you just do smoke marijuana? What else kind of drugs did you do? And he's like, oh, I don't really remember. But is that somebody who just doesn't remember, or is he being evasive?
Well, it could be one or the other, but the question is, does it matter? Because that might speak to his credibility, the fact that he was doing drugs. Does he remember everything from that night? What's this guy like? And that might feed into the jury's perspective. But remember, with all of these facts that the defense is trying to bring up with respect to this witness, they don't have to prove that he did it. The defense is looking to raise enough reasonable doubt that he could have been the one that committed the crime, not the defendant, for the purpose of getting a couple of jurors to say, I'm not sold that the defendant is the one that actually committed this crime.
But isn't this case unique for the prosecution? Because they're not just trying to show that George Birch did it, but Douglas Dietrich didn't do it. They're the ones who he's on the stand for them, and they have to put him first. It's not like the defense called him first. So aren't they trying to prove one thing and disprove another? That's what makes this case unique. It's an alternative suspect theory.
Right, and alternative suspect theories are often challenging for the prosecution, but realistically, they just have to prove their case against the defendant beyond a reasonable doubt. That's their obligation. Of course, from a jury perspective, if the defense can put somebody else in the hot seat in that way and say, look, it wasn't the defendant, it was this guy over here, it's a lot easier to sell a jury on an alternate theory than on just, hey, and he didn't do it, we don't know who done it theory. So I agree with you, Jesse. The practical impact might be that the prosecution now has to make sure that this witness on the stand isn't going to incriminate himself in any way in order to prove their theory. But that's not their legal obligation. They're really there to show this is what happened on this night. This guy did not do it. He wasn't even there.
The fact that he took a shower before the police came, remember, he didn't file a missing persons report until the next day. He took a shower before the police came. He wore same clothes the next day that he wore in the night in question. So you have to wonder, if somebody killed somebody, you wouldn't be wearing the same clothes. His behavior doesn't seem, from what we've seen so far, as somebody who had something to hide.
Right, and that's what the prosecution is absolutely going to capitalize on, and I think you'll hear a lot about that in closing statements. That's what they're going to focus on.
Right.
But the defense is going to talk about that shower and the missing persons report.
Yeah.
Because they're going to latch onto whatever they can to say, look, jury, you might not buy that this guy did it, but if you don't, beyond a reasonable doubt is not fulfilled if you think that this could have been the guy. So that's really where this case is going.
Let's see how effective that cross-examination was by the defense when Douglas Dietrich was on the stand. We have a clip from yesterday. Take a look.
What about when you smoked weed at the watering hole?
It was one of those vape pens or whatever they call them, and it was I don't know, being like passed around in the crowd, and somebody handed it to me. I don't recall who, and I did take a puff off it.
And you gave Greg your Adderall earlier on May 20th?
I don't recall giving him any of mine, but I don't know.
And then you snorted that amphetamine with Greg at the sardine can?
No, I did not at the sardine can. I mean, are you talking about inside, or what do you
When did
mean?
you snort amphetamine with Greg or Adderall with Greg?
I'm trying to recall if I did, because I remember saying to Greg, I don't want to snort any. I don't like that. I do have a prescription for it, and I do take it regularly, the correct way to, and just ingest it. I take it daily, and I just don't like typically snorting anything, so.
But you snorted it on that night, that morning?
I think at some point I did. I don't know if it was like when we were leaving the watering hole, or when we had just maybe gotten to the sardine can. We parked in that back bank parking lot. I think it might have been then. I just don't totally recall when I did.
So you snorted Adderall with Greg?
I think I did a little bit. I'm not certain on that, though.
I'm just looking for a yes or no answer. You snorted amphetamine with Greg?
It's hard to, from all the stories and everything I've heard afterwards, and I just don't know. I would lean towards yes, but I just don't specifically recall that me actually doing it. I remember the opportunity to, and I do remember saying no, that I wasn't going to, but I think because there was like 2 times, and I know one time I said no for sure, and maybe I think the one time I did, and I don't know when that was. I think either when we left the watering hole, or it was in Greg's car, I believe.
And then moving back to when you're at your house, Greg eventually left?
Yeah, after a short time period of us being there.
Dallas left?
Yep, a short time after Greg left.
And then you testified yesterday that you did your nighttime routine.
Yes.
What is that?
Basically, getting a glass of ice water, brushing my teeth, taking my contacts out, washing my face, and then getting ready for bed. Just undressing.
And then you testified that you woke up the next morning. When was that?
I don't know the exact time, but I think it was between like 6 and 7, like 6:30, I'm guessing.
So roughly that's 8 hours since you had saw Nikki, according to your testimony.
Yeah, that would be, I think it was about, I'm guessing around 11 o'clock that I had last seen her.
You did not call the police at 6:30?
No,
You did not call Nicole's sister at 6:30?
no,
You did not call Nicole's mother at 6:30?
no, I did not.
You didn't call any of your friends at 6:30?
No, I did not.
You didn't call your parents?
Nope,
You didn't call your brother?
no, I did not.
You just went back to bed.
Yeah, I was tired, I was hungover, and had a crying baby and took care of him and fed him and went back to bed right away.
And you knew where Nikki was at that time?
No, I did not.
And then you woke up again around 11.
Yeah, I think approximately 11 o'clock.
And now it had been 12 hours since you had last seen Nikki.
Correct.
She still wasn't home for Dylan.
No, she was not.
Did you search for Nikki on foot or by vehicle?
No, I did not.
Still didn't call the police
I did not at that time, no.
because you knew you didn't have to.
I don't know what I was starting to get concerned and, because I figured she was out, if she stayed out late, that, she was probably going to sleep in as well and probably feeling it similar to me, hungover and tired, that she was going to, sleep it off, that, we had a lot to drink that night.
You finally called police around 4:30. Does that sound correct?
Yes.
And that's 17 hours since you last saw her.
Yeah, I think so, yep.
And that's also after her body was already found.
Yeah, at that time, and afterwards I did, yeah, that would be after.
And that's after a large police buildup off Hoffman Road.
Yeah, I was unaware of that police buildup until well after the fact.
That's defense attorney Lee Schuchert really grilling the victim's boyfriend in the George Birch case out of Wisconsin. Again, we do expect a live feed any moment in that courtroom. As soon as we have it, we'll make sure to start up for the day. I want to bring in again Misty Marris. Misty, you're hearing them grilling him, saying it was 8 hours when you didn't speak the last time you saw her. You didn't call the police until 17 hours after last time you saw her. You didn't look for her at all. You didn't have to look for her because you didn't have to, meaning you killed her. What do you think of his style, that defense attorney's Lee Schuchert's style of doing that?
I actually really liked his style, and there's several different ways that a defense attorney strategically approaches a case like this. One way is to be that bull in a china shop where you feel the tension between the witness and the attorney, and it's really kind of over the top and contentious. That's not what he did at all. You saw him ask the questions, establish a timeline, and kind of back the witness into the narrative that he wanted, just as you said, Jesse. Okay, so you didn't call this person, you didn't call the police, you didn't tell anybody that she was missing, you weren't concerned. Then all of a sudden, whoop, body's found, call the police. It's really a strategy that's effective because you establish the timeline and then the witness is forced to say, no, I didn't inform anybody.
Obviously, I have no idea what happened. We're all following it the same way as everybody else, but think about our viewers, okay? Our viewers out there. How many people have a fight with a significant other and you ignore the other person maybe until the next day? And he thought that she was sleeping at another house. And even if they did share a child together and they did live together, people get into fights. They go to a friend's house. They go to a family member's house. Again, you can see it both ways, can't you?
Definitely could see it both ways. I do think one of the most effective points that the defense attorney made in this particular instance is the fact that he called the police after the body was already found, and he pinned that part of the timeline down. So that's kind of a convenient fact. But you have to understand, this is what the defense attorney is going to do. He's going to focus and capitalize on the fact that this timeline is probably the most incriminating piece of evidence that he has to pin this on Doug Dietrich. So that's really where the focus is going to be.
Now, we can try to track Doug. The way we track him is with a Fitbit, and that is really what has captured the nation's attention with this case because it's novel. It's a novel issue. Tracking somebody by their Fitbit data. We know that the court is going to allow in step counting data for Douglas Dietrich. We know where he went. But what is not allowed is sleep counting data, basically when he rested. Misty, I understand why it wasn't left in that issue. The sleep counting data is kind of still being resolved in the courts, but that's not the full picture of where he was. So I'm kind of troubled by that a bit.
Right. I understand it. This is really interesting because Fitbits have been in the focus of criminal investigations, civil cases. It's a whole new area that's being used to really investigate crime.
Because people wear it all the time.
Because people wear it all the time. It not only tracks heart rate, it tracks your steps. There was a case in Connecticut where it was used when to just poke holes in a witness's account of the events based on the amount of steps that the victim took during the pertinent time period. So this stuff is really, really compelling in trial. Now, alone, Fitbit data doesn't really mean much, right? Oh, whatever amount of steps take per day. But coupled with testimony and other pieces of evidence, it can really almost crack the case. But to your point, Jesse, yes, the step counting is going to be allowed in, but the sleep data is not. And that's what the prosecution wanted to say. They wanted to say, look, Doug Dietrich couldn't have done this. His Fitbit says he was sleeping at the time. But from a legal perspective, the reason you're not going to see that data come into a courtroom for a while, number one, there's a lawsuit that questions the accuracy of that data. And it's been, by experts have criticized heart rate data from wrist devices that it's not accurate.
Yeah.
So it would be more prejudicial than probative given the fact that it might not be accurate data.
Now, the defense doesn't want any of that evidence in because it does track, in a way, where Douglas Dietrich was that night. And again, we have to track the locations of all the players here. We know, according to George Birch, or according to the testimony the jury will hear, that he did sleep, well, this is according to their testimony, that he did sleep with, he had sex with Nicole Vanderheiden outside of her house that she shared with Douglas Dietrich, and then killed her and brought her to a field where her body was ultimately found. So, where was Douglas Dietrich? Was he remained at the house? Did he go to the field? That's what's going to be coming into evidence when that Fitbit data comes in, and it's going to be interesting to watch. Misty, one last question for you before I want to show some more cross-examination. What's more believable, though? A random act of violence, which can definitely happen, and which is what the prosecution has stated as, this was a random act of violence in the community, meaning George Birch is the killer, or somebody that knows the victim, a boyfriend, and they seem to be fighting that night in question, and maybe they did have a problem in their relationship. We usually target the boyfriend and the husband, not saying it's a good thing, but what makes more sense?
You always look to somebody who has a relationship with the victim first from a police perspective, especially when you know there had been an altercation earlier that night. And you saw what I think is interesting, the prosecution in their direct examination addressed these text messages between the two where you had contentious relationships. So they're hitting the nail on the head there. They're not waiting for the defense to bring it up.
All right, well, speaking of the defense, let's watch them cross-examine some more of Douglas Dietrich. This is from yesterday. Take a look.
Because you were the suspect in Nicole's death.
At that time, I was not. I was not told that I was a suspect. I had saw those news articles that there was a missing body. I had a lot of feelings and thoughts going through my head and saying, praying that it's not her. And then at the same time, I'm thinking, oh my God, it is her. And it was just a very emotional time for me.
They called you the following days, correct?
They called me on Sunday at some point, yeah.
And they scheduled a meeting to collect your DNA?
Yeah, I think there was a couple calls back and forth. He said he would call me back, and then he gave me his number, and I think I called him back, and I don't really recall who called who back, and we did speak, I think like 2 times, maybe 3 times.
So that's a yes.
On Sunday, yes, yes.
And you chose not to give a DNA sample.
That is correct, after I had gotten some advice.
You chose not to give a DNA sample.
I was kind of told not to, so, I mean, I was willing to give one.
And you made the choice not to.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, yes.
And you stayed in contact with Dallas too, because she was concerned.
I believe I spoke with her a time or two after, on Sunday maybe. I don't know. I was talking to a lot of people, and people were calling me.
And she was upset.
I don't recall even the context of any of the conversations really on Sunday. I was a wreck.
She said, "What happened, Doug?" And you said, "I don't know. She hit her head."
I don't recall saying anything about her hitting her head at all.
You told Dallas, "I don't know. She hit her head."
I do not recall that, sir.
When you woke up on May 21st, Nikki's vehicle was in the garage, correct?
Yes.
And you drove that vehicle on May 21st?
No, I did not.
Why wouldn't you drive that vehicle to try to look for Nikki?
Because I did not have a key for it.
Doug, investigators found the keys in your house on a key rack that was actually labeled keys. How did you not know those were in your house?
Objection, Your Honor. That is a fact, not an evidence, and it's not accurate.
Sustained.
And then moving on, Doug, to the evening of May 23rd, you were at your parents' house on Euro Lane,
That's, yeah, on Monday, yes.
and you received a call from Sergeant Steffens.
Yes, I did.
On direct examination, you said that call made you nervous.
Well, yeah, she said she was coming over to ask me more questions and, you know,
So that call made you nervous.
not really nervous. I was just, you know, a lot of thoughts were going through my mind. I was just emotional wreck at, you know, that entire time.
You testified yesterday that call made you nervous. Is that a yes or a no?
Yeah, partially I was nervous, you know.
Is that a yes or a no?
Wait, let's not badger the witness. He's testified yesterday that it made him nervous. Let's go on to the next question.
And then the police did show up.
Yeah, 15 minutes or so after that.
At that point, the police knew Nicole had been murdered, correct?
I believe so. They did not say anything, but
They knew she was murdered 118 feet from your house.
I don't know what they knew at that point.
You knew all along what happened to Nikki.
No, I did not.
The police are at your parents' door and they make you come outside, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I just stepped out, yes.
They put you in handcuffs,
Yep,
and that's when the Brown County Sheriff's Office arrested you and told you you were under arrest for the murder of Nicole Vanderheiden.
that is correct.
No further
That's the
questions.
defense hammering away against the victim's boyfriend in the George Birch case, which we are covering here on the network live. We expect a live feed any moment, so you're not going to want to miss anything. It is a really interesting case out of Wisconsin that we've been covering this past week. Misty, we keep talking about the fact of the boyfriend on the stand. George Birch will take the stand to explain his story. What's some of the dangers of that? Just real quick, we only have about 20 seconds.
Yeah, there's a lot of danger in putting a defendant on the stand. It's usually last resort, but in this particular case, I don't see how you establish his narrative without putting George Birch up there to tell it. So, Hail Mary to the jury. See if you can raise reasonable doubt.
Going to be interesting to watch, and we're going to cover it here on Law&Crime Live. You're not going to want to miss anything. Hopefully we'll have a live feed when we come back from this short commercial break. A lot at stake for everyone in this case. We'll be back in a minute. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Law&Crime Live, everybody. We are covering the George Birch case out of Wisconsin. We're waiting for a live feed in the courtroom. As soon as we have it, we're going to make sure to go to it. And we expect a very busy day in that courtroom where the prosecution and the defense are battling it out about who killed Nicole Vanderheiden back in May of 2016, this beautiful young mother that was taken in the prime of her life. Her body was found 3 miles from her home. She suffered blunt force trauma to the head, and she was strangled as well. Now, we know George Birch's DNA is all over her. George Birch is the defendant. His DNA was all over her. His cell phone pinpoints him at 4 key locations that night, including where her body was found. And despite all that overwhelming evidence that the prosecution will be putting forward, they're saying, the defense, that it wasn't him, it was Douglas Dietrich, Nicole's boyfriend, who did it. Again, I want to bring in Law&Crime trial analyst, fellow host here on the network, Misty Marris. What I think is interesting, when we talk about the victim here, it's hard to talk about because she is the victim here. But the way that you hear from the witnesses is that she was drinking that night, she got angry, she ran away. Okay, if we take all those facts as true, I see it playing both sides. So you could say from the defense point of view, well, if she was angry at Doug and Doug was angry at her, it gives him a motive to kill her. But the other side of it is, if she got drunk and was upset at him, thought he was talking to other girls, then maybe she cheated on him with George Birch. Which narrative makes more sense to you?
Well, you know, I'm actually not necessarily settled on either narrative, but I do think that a jury will pay attention, and this really plays into the defense, to a domestic dispute that escalates too far. And that is what the defense is looking to show, to raise reasonable doubt.
Right, and one of the things we talk about here is the evidence in the case. And what I want to play for you right now is the testimony of Matthew Peterson, who is a neighbor that discovered the blood outside of Nicole and Doug's house. Take a look.
Exhibit, yours is in the furthest to the bottom and left, is that correct?
Correct.
And are you also familiar with a neighbor of yours, Douglas Dietrich?
Yes.
And you're familiar with where that gentleman lives? Is that also depicted in this photograph?
Correct.
For the record, you're pointing at the top left most residence, is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you. Have a seat. Directing your attention to May 21st of 2016, do you recall that day?
Yes, I do.
And what about that day sticks out to you?
I went out to mow my lawn at about 10 in the morning and came upon an area in front of my yard that was had a significant amount of blood.
And where was this area specifically?
It was abutting the curb at the very, very front of the yard, almost directly in front of my home.
Do you want him to show that on the photograph? Why don't we put the photograph back on the big screen, and he can point that out with the pointer.
Approximately here.
It's approximately in the middle of the photograph to the left edge at the grass line and the curb, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. And at that point, did you locate anything else in your yard?
Not immediately. I did proceed to begin mowing my lawn, and on the very first pass of mowing my lawn close to the curb, I heard a click. It was sounded like my blade of my lawnmower hitting something, and I shut my lawnmower off and found a piece of cord that I picked up and examined and then set aside.
Mr. Peterson, I'm showing you two exhibits marked 65 and 66. Could you identify each of those documents for us?
65 is a view from the street of my yard, including the portion of the curb that still has blood stains and a piece of cord. And Exhibit 66 is a close-up view of some of those blood spots on the curb and a piece of cord.
Do both of those exhibits appear to be fair and accurate depictions of the observations you made on May 21st of 2016?
Yes, they do.
I move to admit exhibits 65 and 66 at this time.
Subject to cross, any objection to 65 and 66 being received?
No objection.
65 and 66 are received.
And permission to publish, Your Honor.
They can be published on the big screen.
Mr. Peterson, we're looking at exhibit 65, is that correct?
Yes.
And you stated earlier you located the wire in your yard, correct?
Correct.
Could you, do you recall where approximately you came across the wire?
I do recall approximately where.
And could you point out in the exhibit approximately where that was? For the record, you're pointing towards the middle of the photograph a little bit above the curb, is that correct?
Correct.
And do you recall approximately how far away you were from the curb at that time?
I'm guessing approximately 1 foot.
Okay. You can have a seat, thank you.
Blood found at the crime scene on the George Birch case. We know the courtroom is filling up. When we come back from this short commercial break, we'll go right into the courtroom. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Law&Crime Live, everybody. We're covering the George Birch case, a man who was charged with the murder of a young mother. We see the courtroom filling up. As soon as we have a live feed, we're going to make sure to go to it. I want to talk to Misty Marris real quick about one of the things in this case that's a little unique. The blood of Nicole and a cord, which seems to be used to strangle her, was all found outside of her house. The fact that the crime scene was outside of her house, what does that tell you?
Well, certainly the defense is going to capitalize on that. Why would George Birch bring her outside of her house? Maybe this is truly was at the hands of the other person that lives there. So
Well,
they might be. That's where the defense is going to go.
The defense says that he had sexual relations with her outside of the house.
Right, because a lot of facts, what's interesting about this case is some of the evidence that would normally be so detrimental to the defense really isn't in dispute,
Yeah.
right? The fact that there's DNA, the fact that they were in contact that night, those aren't the issues. The question is, did the boyfriend hold a gun to George Birch's head that help me dispose of this body and kill her?
Misty,
it's kind of a fantastical
It's
story.
too unbelievable a story. We're talking about Douglas Dietrich, the boyfriend of Nicole Vanderheiden. Let's now show you a clip of his testimony when he was talking about being contacted by the police. Take a look.
Did you return to the Berkeley residence at all on the 23rd?
No, I did not.
I know this is probably not easy, Doug, but at some point then on the 23rd, did the police return and have contact with you?
Yes, and I had contacted, or Greg had called me, I think at some point, and I was in contact with Nikki's family. Don't know exactly what times during the day, but I think at some point in the afternoon on Monday, Greg was saying, you know, they're talking to me and they're like thinking it's you and all this stuff, and I'm like, oh my God. And I talked to Aaron. Actually, Steffens called me. This is probably, I don't know, 5 o'clock or something time frame, and asked where I was, and I said, oh, I was at my parents' house, and said that they needed to ask me a few more questions. And I was like, oh my God. And I talked to Aaron, I believe, and he's, you know, I had a real
Aaron
short.
Kolinsky?
Yes, Aaron Kolinsky. And he said to stay strong, buddy, or something like that. And then the cops came and they arrested me.
And I'm not going to ask you about your conversations, but what were you thinking? What was going through your head when you were arrested?
Just like, I don't know. I was like, why, how am I in this position? You know, what's going on? I didn't get it. This is, I think I said to him that this is wrong. I was told not to, I was advised not to say anything, and I wanted to say so many things, you know, this, I had nothing to do with this. You guys are making a big mistake here, and
We're talking about the case of a murder of a young woman out of Wisconsin, Nicole Vanderheiden, a beautiful young mother. Again, I'm here with Misty Marris. You heard the Douglas Dietrich testifying, the boyfriend. He was initially arrested and released. Can you just explain to our viewers real quick, what does it really mean when someone is arrested for a crime and then released? They didn't have enough evidence to hold them?
Yeah, it means that to be arrested for a crime is a very low standard. A reasonable suspicion, it's much less than actually keeping somebody and charging them with a crime. So there wasn't enough evidence at the time to point to him to hold him on this crime.
Because you know there's going to be people who watch this and say, did the police really do a thorough job? Did they really investigate him thoroughly? What would you say to that?
I would say if the defense puts on a case, that's something that they're really going to capitalize on. And you've seen that in many other trials, that not only did the defense try and present evidence that would refute the prosecution's theory of the case, they also say, well, the police didn't do the right amount of work to really investigate certain individuals. And in this case, I think you're going to see that for Doug Dietrich.
Again, it just becomes a question of what makes more sense. Now, we talk about the idea of the murder happening outside the house. The idea that the defense would say is that George Birch was having sex with Nicole outside of the house, which, by the way, isn't that a bit strange in itself? If you're going to be cheating with somebody, if Nicole's going to be cheating with somebody, she's going to do it outside of her house?
Yeah, and I guess that begs the question, well, do they have this tumultuous relationship with this dispute? Does she want him to be jealous? Was she so intoxicated that she wasn't really sure where she was? Mm-hmm. And I think you're going to see the prosecution flip it, and this is what they've said. They said, this is a woman who was intoxicated, who came across the wrong person at the
Yeah.
wrong time. And that's what they're going to be playing up.
There's a lot of strange aspects about this case, and one of them is that George Birch has seen the inside of a courtroom before, Misty. Explain it to our viewers why this guy's a little unique.
Yeah, well, this is 20 years ago. He was on trial for murder, but he was acquitted.
Different kind of murder, right? That was about a murder of a gang member. So it's not like he was accused of murdering a young woman, a young mother. It's a little different.
Right. Yeah, I suppose, yes, there's a distinction there. Murder is murder.
But as you said in the break, how many people are on trial for murder twice?
Well,
in their
that's what
lifetime?
Jesse and I were talking about. We were saying if you find yourself in the defense seat for a murder 2 times and you're wrongfully accused,
Life
it seems
choices.
a little,
You got to look at your
a little
life
strange.
choices a little bit. There's a reason.
But interestingly enough, a jury is more likely than not going to hear about that prior acquittal. They're not going to hear about the fact that he was on trial for murder.
Because he wasn't convicted.
Right. And so those are some of the interesting aspects of being an outsider here, where we're analyzing the trial and breaking it down. We know a little bit more than the jury's going to know. We know about that Fitbit data with respect to Doug Dietrich sleeping. We know about this prior acquittal, and again, found innocent by a jury of his peers. So,
And we also know the fact about what the defense's theory is, that George Birch had sexual relations with Nicole Vanderheiden. At least that's the theory being put forward by the defense. We are expecting a live feed into the courtroom any moment. When we come back from our break, we're going to make sure to go to it. You don't want to miss anything of this case. There's a lot of aspects to it that are interesting, not just the torrid love triangle, but the evidence in this case. Fitbit data being used to track where a person is. It's a novel issue in the legal community. We'll take a quick break. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Law and Crime Live, everybody. We're covering one of the biggest cases in the country right now. That is the George Birch case out of Wisconsin, a man who was charged with first-degree intentional homicide in connection with the death of Nicole Vanderheiden. And despite George Birch's DNA all over her body, and despite cell phone evidence pinpointing him at key locations that night, including the crime scene and where her body was found, the defense is saying he didn't do it. The defense is saying that it was Douglas Dietrich, Nicole's boyfriend, as the person who did it. And the theory that they're going with is that Nicole and George met that night, the night in question. They had sex outside of her home in Wisconsin, and that Douglas Dietrich knocked George out. And when he woke up, he saw that Nicole was dead, and Doug forced him at gunpoint to remove Nicole's body to a field and bury it there. It's an outlandish story, but will it convince at least one juror? That's what we're talking about. What I want to play right now for you is some of the, again, more continuation of Douglas Dietrich on the stand, because he is such a pivotal witness. Now, I want you to look at this carefully, and I want you to listen very carefully, because look at his demeanor. Listen to his answers. Do you think he's hiding something? Think about what the jury might be thinking about when they hear him on the stand, and you can be a judge for yourself. Take a look.
I mean, I was undecided. You know, we had discussions, I think, after we might have had an argument, and that's, you know, when I was feeling a little down at that point and sent that message, and then Nikki and I later talked about it and reconciled our differences and moved forward.
So when you would have those types of arguments, would you typically make that jump to then breaking up with Nikki? Was that common?
No, it wasn't common. I think maybe if that was like the one time or a couple times, or if it was in the same day, or I don't really recall.
What were you arguing about?
I don't recall. I don't think it was,
Did you argue often?
no, not that often at all.
But you can't remember such few times today?
I'm sorry,
You can't remember that argument at all?
I don't remember that specific argument. There was a couple arguments that were just over some minor things, and I know she would complain or, you know, be upset with me for I would go out, and if I was going out with my friends and she was staying at home, and I think maybe she was, you know, she wanted to maybe join and she couldn't, and she was home, and I don't know what was going through her mind.
So you said that you would define it as a minor thing?
Yeah, I would. I mean, it wasn't.
So it was a minor thing, but then your ultimate conclusion was that you were going to break up with Nikki and have the kids move out of the house?
No, that wasn't my conclusion. I I mean, was this maybe an off-the-cuff comment? I don't know.
Do you typically overreact like that?
No,
Just that time with your mom?
I don't know. I don't know if it was just that time. I mean, what are you referring to?
Any other times?
Any other times ever, or any other times in May?
May of 2016.
I really don't. I mean, it was all kind. I don't know. That's a long time ago. I don't really know.
You testified to a lot of things today that happened in May of 2016.
Yeah, to a specific night that, you know, I've had replaying in my mind for a long time now, and
Where were you working in May of 2016?
I wasn't working too much. I was still working. I was working a little bit from home and working not as much as I should at our office at D3 Builders.
You talked earlier with the state, you testified about some of the licenses that you have. What were those again?
I have my certified building contractor's license in Florida, and also my it's a dwelling contractor license in Wisconsin.
Did you have that Wisconsin license in May of 2016?
Yes, I did. I believe I had it for 4 years at that point.
You were interviewed by law enforcement on May 20th, correct? Or May 21st, I mean?
Yes.
And at that point, you told them that you weren't working at that point in time, and you kind of joked with them that you didn't really like working with family at times, right?
Well, yeah, it said, you know, it's tough working with family, you know, we see each other often, and got a lot of family. My grandfather, my father, my brother, we're all in the same office, and small office, and, you know, it's family. And
That's the victim's boyfriend testifying in the George Birch case. Now, we do have a live feed in the courtroom, but I should let you know that a juror is actually late. That is the reason court hasn't started yet. Misty, how could a juror be late?
Look, it happens. The jury in this case isn't sequestered, so they're not being carted back and forth to the courtroom. You got to understand, jurors are living and breathing this case. Hey, but
And
it's still
ignoring,
like,
and hopefully ignoring
Yeah.
any information about it.
hopefully they're not watching this right now. Maybe they're late because they're watching this right now.
I hope they're
that
not.
should not be
I hope
the
they're
case.
not watching
but
it.
No, you got to be cut off from the media. You got to be cut off from reading any stories or television that might be covering the case.
Yeah.
And it really is. It's kind of isolating in a sense. You can't talk about your entire day with anyone but your fellow jurors.
Misty, real quick, we have about 30 seconds. Just talk about the idea. We have a discussion here about Douglas Dietrich, who was just on the stand. He said, they asked him, were you making plans to break up? No, not really. I was just upset. He seemed a little aloof, a little clueless. Is that what you made of him?
Yeah, and I think the defense was really trying to push that fact that he's not necessarily being truthful about their relationship, or at least trying to give the jury that impression that, hey, didn't you tell your mom you wanted to break up? Well, no, I really didn't. The text messages, he was puzzled why she would say anything negative about their relationship. I think the defense is really capitalizing on that to show this was a tumultuous relationship, and that escalated.
And the state needs him to be a likable witness. Otherwise, if they don't like him, they might think he had something to do with this crime, which again is what the defense is arguing. The defense is arguing that even despite the overwhelming evidence against George Birch, their client, it was Douglas Dietrich who knocked out George Birch and killed Nicole Vanderheiden. That's the theory that we know so far that the defense will be going with. Again, a juror is late in the courtroom. As soon as that juror comes back, we're going to make sure to go live into the courtroom out of Wisconsin. You don't want to miss anything. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back to Law&Crime Live, everybody. We are covering the George Birch case out of Wisconsin. And maybe that's not the right way to say it, because this really is the murder case of a beautiful young mother named Nicole Vanderheiden. There she is right there. And from all accounts, from witnesses who've testified, she was a great mother. And she was taken too early, taken in the prime of her life. Her body was found 3 miles from her home. She had blunt force trauma to the head, and she was strangled to death. Now, who's on trial? George Birch. And the reason he's on trial is because there's such overwhelming forensic data against him, including DNA and cell phone records, pinpointing him different areas, different locations that night, including where the body was found. and his DNA was found all over her body. Now, despite all that, the defense is saying he didn't do it. It was Douglas Dietrich, Nicole's boyfriend, who she lived with and shared a child with. Misty, as we wait for the live feed in the courtroom, and again, our viewers, we're waiting for a juror to actually show up in the courtroom. This is what it is. This is Courtroom TV. But here's the question I have for you. Talking about the victim and how much she had to drink and what she was like that night and her being aggressive, that's an interesting strategy. That's an interesting way you have to talk about the victim when you're an attorney, right? Under cross-examination or even direct examination. You don't want to put blame on the victim, or you don't want to say anything negative about the victim. How do you do that?
It's really difficult. It's a fine line that you have to toe in both positions, both as the prosecutor and the defense. Sometimes the victim's actions could have an impact on the case. And so very often you do have to bring up some of those facts. But victim blaming never sits well with a jury, especially in this case. You have this beautiful woman who is now dead. And that's not lost on anybody.
Because the defense has to be careful, because they're painting her as a woman that cheated on her boyfriend with George Birch. That can get bad for them.
Right. And by the same token, they're also acknowledging that there was this, their relationship between her and her boyfriend wasn't so great that night. And they're going through all of those facts. So maybe that softens the blow with respect to the victim. But what I do think is interesting about this case is that every single fact that would have the defendant dead to rights is not really being contested by the defense, because they're saying that they had a relationship that night, they met that night, he was where the cell phone data says he is, the DNA evidence, of course, they had relations that evening. So it's kind of an interesting case, because you have to get into those dynamics about the victim, the boyfriend, in order to raise that reasonable doubt.
Well, speaking of dynamics, let's get into the text message conversations, okay? We know that Nicole and Doug, her boyfriend, exchanged text messages, and she was upset at him. She thought that he was cheating with other girls. Now, I'm going to read you what he said. He said, LOL, stop, be good, see you at the sardine can, and LMAO, really? When she kept accusing him, are you with other girls? Because remember, he was at a different bar than she was at. He said, stop, babe, I'll be there soon. What do you make of these texts? That it wasn't a big deal? Or you could look at it the other way, was it strategic in what he was writing her, if he was planning on doing something later that night?
Yeah, I mean, it could be one way or the other, I guess. I mean, I see it as not a big deal. Maybe a couple that fights frequently, that, you know, if in most circumstances, if you're so appalled that someone's accusing you of cheating, you would have a more over-the-top reaction. That would lead me to believe that maybe they have these types of arguments or altercations frequently. And what I thought was really interesting is in some of those text messages where she said, I'm sick of you being abusive, there was more explosive messages that came out. Actually came out by the prosecution because they wanted to get in front of it. But his response was, oh, I thought it was puzzling. I thought it was strange. Acting like they didn't have a tumultuous relationship. Circle back to the cross-examination, you see that come up again. The defense attorney says, didn't you tell your mother you wanted to break up and that you were having issues? Oh, well, I didn't really mean that. A defense tactic here is to poke holes in his credibility. Is he misrepresenting what their relationship was like? And I think that's where the defense is going here. And hey, the whole reason, they don't have to prove that he murdered her. The defense doesn't have to prove that the boyfriend murdered her. They just have to raise reasonable doubt. That's it. It's a very different standard. They just have to get it in the jury's head that George Birch might not be the one who did this.
And one of the ways they might be doing that is showing that they had a problem that night in question. And I want to play for you right now Aaron Kalinsky, who is a friend of Douglas Dietrich, talking about the fight that occurred between Nicole and her boyfriend that night, Doug. And it gets really interesting. Listen carefully.
And the group is still having, from what you can tell, a good time. Nobody's angry, nobody's upset.
No, but it's getting to the point where everybody's thinking about going home or getting closer to home.
And then Nikki tries to call Doug, and he doesn't answer, right?
Right.
And then Angela tries to call Doug, and he does answer, right?
It wasn't back to back, but it was probably within 10 minutes or so.
And that's when Nikki's entire attitude changed.
Correct.
How would you describe her? Was she angry that Doug didn't answer her call?
Yes.
So up until that point, Nikki was having, from what we've heard today, a pretty good time, maybe a great time. And then it was Doug not answering her call that really made her angry.
Right.
And she was so angry, she just left the bar.
Correct.
And then you were somewhat worried and you tried to walk after her.
You're right.
And you did everything you could to try to keep her with your group.
I did.
And then you testified that the next day you sent some text to Doug and you said he seemed concerned. Were you actually with Doug at all the next day?
No, I wasn't.
Did you talk to him on a phone call?
I don't recall talking to him on the phone Saturday.
So how do you actually know he was concerned?
Just the way through his texts, I could, because our texts are usually upbeat and about something we're gonna do, and I could just tell the tone, and he was different. I could just tell something, you know, really concerned, and yeah.
And then you eventually ended up talking to Investigator Shield.
Correct.
And when you were talking to Investigator Shield and telling him about that next day on the 21st, Doug had told you that he was going to file a missing person report at 6 p.m.
I don't remember 6 p.m., but
If I were to show you the statement you gave Investigator Shield from that day, would that help just jog your memory? It's a long time ago.
I'll look at it, but again, they came at 3 in the morning, and I had taken sleeping pills before that, so my recollection wasn't at the best. But yeah, I can look at it.
May I approach?
Go right ahead.
So I'm just going to show you the statement that you gave Officer Shield, and then I'm going to show you the third page. I have it highlighted on right at the bottom. If you could just read that last paragraph.
Me then told me he was going
Sorry,
to.
you can read that to yourself.
Mhm.
So did that help refresh your memory, Aaron?
It didn't do anything. Again, I made that statement at 3 a.m. on sleeping pills, so
Sure. But did rereading it help you remember what you said on that day?
no, it didn't.
All right, everybody, good news. We now have a live feed in the George Birch case out of Wisconsin. The juror showed up. The judge was not too happy about that. New witnesses on the stand. I want to thank Misty Marris for coming on.
Thanks, Jesse. Appreciate it.
I can't wait to see you soon. All right, everybody, let's listen in now as the next witness takes the stand in the George Birch case.
If I